A fire broke out inside one unit at a refinery in Texas. Diesel prices were already flirting with an all-time record before that fire started. On the evening of March 23, 2026, a diesel hydrotreater at Valero's Port Arthur refinery released process fluid and ignited. The blast was felt 11 miles away. Local authorities issued a shelter-in-place order for residents near the plant. The unit that failed, known as DHT-243, only processes 47,000 barrels a day, a fraction of the plant's total output, but fighting the fire knocked out the refinery's water supply and steam, and Valero had to shut the entire facility, not just the damaged unit. At the time, the national average price for diesel was sitting at $5.36 a gallon. That was less than 50 cents away from the highest diesel price ever recorded in the United States. Gasoline had climbed past $3.95 a gallon, up from just under $3 a month earlier. Valero's refining margin, what the industry calls the crack spread, had already surged past $54, nearly triple where it started the year. Investors weren't worried. Valero's stock rose more than 6% that week alone. The market had learned something about how one refinery in one town connects to every price sign at every gas station in the country. This isn't the first time a Gulf Coast refinery problem reached every pump in America. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina did something similar at a scale that dwarfs what happened in Port Arthur. Katrina didn't damage one unit at one plant. It took out roughly 1.9 million barrels a day of refining capacity as it came ashore, spread across an entire region. The mechanism connecting a fire in Texas to a price increase in Ohio isn't new. It's the same mechanism that turned a hurricane into a national gas crisis 2 decades ago, and it starts with where America decided to build its refineries in the first place. Hurricane Katrina made landfall on August 29, 2005, and tore through Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Before the storm hit, the Gulf Coast supplied roughly 1/10 of all the crude oil the country consumed, and refineries there produced almost half of the nation's gasoline. That concentration is what made Katrina so dangerous to the fuel supply. It was a storm aimed at the one region doing nearly half the country's refining work. By August 31st, 8 refineries in the Gulf were completely shut down, and a 9th was running at reduced capacity. Damage assessments on 5 of those 8 were delayed for days because responders couldn't safely reach the sites. The Louisiana offshore oil port, which handled about 11% of all the oil the country imported, closed on August 27th. Though it came back online within hours once power was restored. The Colonial Pipeline, the main artery carrying gasoline and diesel from Texas up to the Northeast, lost power at its pumping stations and stopped moving fuel entirely. That shutdown was serious enough that Vice President Dick Cheney personally intervened to redirect utility crews toward the substations that kept the pipeline running. Crude oil futures spiked to over $70 a barrel in the days after landfall, a record at the time. Gasoline prices jumped by more than 50 cents a gallon in Ohio, 40 cents in Georgia, 30 cents in Maine. Diesel reached an inflation-adjusted high of $2.82 a gallon that September, and analysts expected it to climb even higher into October. Then, about a month after Katrina, Hurricane Rita hit the same region again. Even counting the refineries that had already come back online from Katrina, Rita's additional damage meant 14% of the country's total refining capacity was offline at once. Rita alone added another 25 cents a gallon to gasoline prices in the week that followed, according to a Federal Trade Commission study of 6 sample cities. By September 7th, Gulf oil production had recovered to only 42% of normal. By early October, the Interior Secretary at the time, Gail Norton, reported that 90% of Gulf oil production and 72% of gas production were still shut in. The federal government responded with tools it doesn't reach for often. The Environmental Protection Agency issued a temporary nationwide waiver of fuel blend standards, allowing gas stations to sell winter formula gasoline in the summer and northern spec fuel in the south, just to keep supply moving. President Bush authorized loans of crude oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to refiners struggling to get feedstock. The Department of Energy is approving loans from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to limit disruptions in crude supplies for refineries, Bush said at the time, adding that the EPA had granted the nationwide waivers specifically to make more gasoline and diesel available across the country. The International Energy Agency, representing oil-consuming nations worldwide, authorized a rare 30 million barrel coordinated release of gasoline and diesel from member countries' reserves. Even with all of that intervention, the supply problems weren't evenly distributed. Bill Weatherspoon of the North Carolina Petroleum Council put it simply at the time, the region didn't have a shortage of gasoline, it had a delivery problem. The pipelines and terminals moving fuel around were as broken as the refineries making it. Recovery was slow and uneven. Some refineries were back within a week, others stayed down for months. Prices gradually fell through the rest of that year, and by the Federal Trade Commission's later analysis, most of the Katrina and Rita price effects had reverted to pre-storm levels by the start of December. The FTC went on to investigate whether refiners had manipulated prices during the crisis. After analyzing financial data from 30 refiners, investigators found that the companies with the biggest price increases were generally the ones that had lost the most supply themselves, not companies profiting off their competitors' misfortune. They found no evidence of the kind of manipulation many had suspected. What Katrina left behind wasn't a story about corporate wrongdoing. It was a demonstration of how much of the country's fuel supply runs through one stretch of coastline and how fast that concentration can turn a regional disaster into a national one. What's the same between March of 2026 and Katrina comes down to geography. More than half of all U.S. refining capacity still sits in Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, largely unchanged as a share of the national total since 2005. Diesel remains the most fragile part of that system in both eras, because ultra-low sulfur diesel has to be processed through specific hydrotreating units that can't simply be swapped for capacity somewhere else. When a hydrotreater goes down, whether it's one unit in Port Arthur or 10 refineries across an entire coastline, the country doesn't have enough spare, geographically spread out capacity to absorb the loss without prices moving. There's a structural echo in the numbers behind the 2026 event that wasn't loudly reported at the time. Going into this year, U.S. refiners had already permanently retired 429,000 barrels a day of capacity in 2025, and distillate stockpiles were at their lowest for that time of year in roughly 3 decades. That's the same underlying condition Katrina exposed, a system with very little slack. What's different is scale, and it isn't close. Katrina and Rita combined took out nearly 2 million barrels a day of refining capacity across roughly 10 refineries for weeks or months at a time. Port Arthur's DHT 243 processes 47,000 barrels a day. Even counting the full plant shutdown that followed, the plant had one crude unit and its fluid catalytic cracker running again within about a month. Numerically, Katrina's disruption was more than an order of magnitude larger than Port Arthur's. There's also a difference in what else was happening in the market at the same time. In 2005, Katrina and Rita were essentially the whole story. There wasn't some other global crisis competing for the blame. In March of 2026, diesel was already closing in on a record high because of the war in Iran and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, weeks before the Port Arthur fire ever started. Analysts who covered the explosion were careful to separate the two. The fire added cents to the price of diesel, while the Hormuz closure was adding dollars. Unlike 2005, nobody in 2026 was asking residents to conserve fuel or watching stations run dry. Katrina caused real physical shortages in multiple states. Port Arthur caused a price bump and a nervous market, not an empty pump. What the Katrina precedent suggests for today's story is narrower than it might first sound. The vulnerability is structurally the same, but the current event, on its own, is a symptom of that vulnerability, not a crisis on the scale of the one that produced it 20 years ago. It's worth being direct about where this comparison stops holding up, because the headline version of this story, "One broken unit in Texas reaching every pump in America," claims more than the evidence actually supports. Katrina's price shock had one clear cause. Port Arthur's did not. The explosion happened in the middle of an already surging market driven by a war on the other side of the world, and untangling how much of the diesel price move belongs to the fire versus the Strait of Hormuz closure isn't something the available reporting lets you do cleanly. The honest way to describe Port Arthur is as a stress test of the same fragile system Katrina exposed, layered on top of a much bigger and unrelated shock, not as the primary cause of a national price spike on its own. It's also worth noting that, unlike in 2005, no federal fuel standard waivers or strategic petroleum reserve loans tied specifically to the Port Arthur incident turned up in the record. Whatever emergency tools exist for a moment like this, they weren't deployed here, at least not visibly, which itself says something about how differently regulators are treating a 47,000-barrel unit fire compared to a hurricane that flattened a region. As of the most recent public reporting, Valero's Port Arthur refinery is still not fully back. The larger of its two crude units was ramping up as of late April, after inspectors found a damaged heater tube unrelated to the original blast. DHT-243 itself, the unit that started this, had not been confirmed back in service in any source available for this story. Nationally, the broader refining system had largely absorbed the loss. By mid-June, U.S. refineries were running at 96% capacity, processing 17.1 million barrels a day, close to normal. But the question of what actually caused the explosion is still unresolved, and it's now sitting in a Jefferson County courtroom. Texas regulators called it an unforeseeable release of process fluid. Lawyers representing residents and property owners near the plant have a different read. In April, a district court ordered Valero to preserve its inspection records and maintenance logs and control room data, the kind of order that only makes sense if someone suspects the word unforeseeable might not survive a closer look. Brent Kuhn, the attorney leading that case, said their priority from the moment of the explosion was making sure the evidence needed to establish what happened and who's responsible was protected. Katrina's aftermath ended with an investigation that cleared the industry of manipulation. Whether Port Arthur's ends the same way is still an open question, and it's one a courtroom will answer long before the next fire does.